Everyone, whether religious or not, would agree that the Bible contains many hard-to-believe accounts and stories. Biblical scholars, though, and critics have uncovered what appeared to be contradictions in many biblical accounts. However, although some aren't easily refuted, there are still others that have been refuted which make these accounts seem less likely to be a contradiction. What's happening, FTD fam? My name is Leroy Kent and welcome back to another episode. And for this one, I'll be sharing the alleged contradiction, and then I'll be sharing the most common refutations of these contradictions. So let's jump in. At number 10, we have Cain's wife. The contradiction is that after killing his brother Cain, he runs off with another woman despite his mother Eve being the only woman on earth. Okay, so the explanation for this is that in Genesis 4 verses 16 to 17, we hear that Cain went and got a wife, okay? And then in Genesis 5 verses 4, we hear that Adam lived 800 years and had enough sons and daughters to populate the entire earth. So because the storytelling is a little bit different for thousands of years ago, all that happened was that we heard Cain's story all at once rather than every single detail in chronological order. So no, he wasn't running off with his mother, he was running off with another one of the women that existed at the time. Inbreeding is at number 9, and the contradiction is that the entire human species is directly descended from Adam and Eve. That means that everybody is literally brother and sister. So there's a lot of inbreeding there. So what's going on here? Now the explanation is that people often tend to forget that the Bible was originally written in ancient Hebrew. So they had a very different language system, and when it comes to translating it, there could be some problems there. So in the early chapters of Genesis, it gets pretty confusing. In Hebrew, Adam actually means man. That's the literal translation of it. So the creation story can either be about one man called Adam and his wife Eve, or it could be about the birth of man in general, multiple men and multiple women. Now, since Genesis 5 verses 1 to 2 explicitly refers to Adam as them, it makes sense to think of biblical Adam as an example of what's known as synecdoche, where a part, one man, is substituted for the whole, the entire human race. So yes, it could be a literal reading or it could be synecdoche. Try saying that word 3 times fast. Alright, next up is the multiple God contradiction. God tells the Israelites that there's only one God, and then he proceeds to mention multiple gods. Okay, so the explanation for this contradiction is that the Bible is filled with statements about different gods. Like, for example, Galatians 4 verses 8 and Isaiah 37 verses 19 claim that most gods were forged in the minds of men, and following their own non-existent law, they made slaves of us all. So the Bible introduces false gods like Moloch and Baal and Dagon and describe them as nothing more as straight up useless and fictional. But what about the times that God refers to himself as multiple people? Like in Genesis, where he says, "Let us make man." Well, that is explained as being a reference to the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. All three make up the one God. So not that there's multiple gods, but that there's only one God still. The next contradiction is, when did Satan enter Judas? Was it before the Last Supper? This passage goes, "And Satan entered into Judas, who was called Iscariot, belonging to the number of the 12. Then came the first day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed." And that's found in the book of Luke, chapter 22, verses 3 and 7. Or was it after the Last Supper? After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." And that's found in the book of John, chapter 13, verses 27. So the explanation of why this is not a contradiction is that both Luke 23 verses 3 and John chapter 13 verses 27 mention Satan entering Judas to lead him to do specific things. In Luke 22 verses 3, it is to get Judas to negotiate with the religious leaders to portray Jesus, while John 13 verse 27 is to quickly carry out the plan of betrayal. So there are two different functions of Satan at different times, so this is explained away as not being a contradiction. From there we move on to number 6, also to do with Judas dying twice. Now this is a pretty big and well-known contradiction, or apparent contradiction I should say. The contradiction is the New Testament claims Judas both hanged himself and also his insides exploded after he fell over. So the explanation of why this is not a contradiction is that although in the book of Matthew, Judas dies in chapter 27 verses 5 by hanging, in the book of Acts 1 verses 18, he falls and his insides gush out. And since people usually don't burst open from falling over, and Judas was already hanging from a tree, well, it makes sense that Luke's account is actually a record of what happened when his corpse falls from the tree from a great height. So Matthew focuses on the hanging part, and Luke, the writer of Acts, he includes a more graphic conclusion. Halfway in at number 5, demon-possessed men. The contradiction is, well, was there one demon-possessed man or was there two? Look at these passages. It says, they came to the other side of the sea into the countries of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tomb with an unclean spirit met him. And that's taken from the book of Mark chapter 5 verses 1 to 2. There's another account talking about two men. When he came to the other side into the country of the Gadarenes, two men who were demon-possessed met him as they were coming out of the tombs. They were so extremely violent that no one could pass by that way. That's taken from Matthew chapter 8 verses 28. And the explanation for this is that no verse actually asserts that there was only one demon-possessed man. So the claim that there's only one man that was possessed by devils is not supported by any text at all. So therefore it's not a contradiction. Number 4 brings us a contradiction about reincarnation. Okay, what am I talking about? You guys are saying, whoa, Leroy, okay. Reincarnation in the Bible? Huh? So the contradiction is that the Bible makes it pretty clear that you only have one life before you either go to heaven or hell. So based on certain versions of the Bible, when Job in the book of Job says, naked I came from my mother's womb and naked I shall return there, is he referring to returning to the womb, or is he actually saying something else? Now this passage is cleared up pretty easily. One example used is that since Jesus himself spoke in parables, taking every single passage literally isn't going to be a wise thing to do. And throughout the story of Job, he uses phrases like, my days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and my flesh is clothed with worms. So he's using a lot of metaphorical language here. So the mother's womb reference is him poetically saying that one day he's going to die. And that's the most simple and most common explanation for this passage. Number 3 brings us, Jesus says fool, another pretty popular one. The contradiction is that according to Jesus, you can go to hell for actually saying fool. And then Jesus himself uses the term some passages later. And the explanation as to why this is not a contradiction is to take in context Matthew chapter 5 verses 21 to 22, where Jesus is clearly using fool as a judgment and an insult. Now when Jesus calls the Pharisees and scribes fools in Matthew 23 verses 17, he explained that they were satisfying themselves rather than giving glory to God. And what they were doing was that they were actually glorifying the gold, the wealth of the temple, rather than the one true God. And doing that would be foolish, hence they were called fools. So not as an insult, but really as a matter of fact. Moving on to number 2, Moses writes his own obituary. Okay, so the contradiction is that Moses is said to have written the first 5 books of the Bible. Now the last of the 5 books, the book called Deuteronomy, actually ends with Moses' death. So how could you write about your death if you're dead? Well, the explanation of why this is not a contradiction is that early versions of the Bible were written on scrolls with breaks between the books. They weren't clear, and some of the books never even had breaks between them. So the Bible is now, as we know it, clearly divided into books and chapters and verses. But at the time, there weren't any definitive breaks between the end of Deuteronomy and the start of the next book, which is Joshua. So the account of Moses dying could just have really belonged to the start of the book of Joshua, which would make more sense. So Moses' death was just put at the end of Deuteronomy just to really complete the book, and Joshua can be given a fresh start. So that's why they say that there's no contradiction with this one. And the last point we're going to end off on is the Gospels don't agree. So the contradiction is that despite seeing exactly the same events, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? They disagree pretty much on everything all the time. This happens. But the explanation given as to why this is not a contradiction and shouldn't be seen this way is that if you take any significant event that happens in life, you'll find that no two eyewitness accounts are ever going to be exactly the same. So if you go to the beach, for example, with some friends on a Friday, by the next day or by the Sunday, you'll all have different accounts on what happened and different wording and different emphasis placed on different events that happened at the beach. And then to make it even worse, if you wait 20 years or 50 years and you're trying to recount the story, or someone's recounting the story, everything is going to be different except certain key points that would be constant. So given that the Gospels are attributed to different authors and supposedly written many years after Jesus, the accounts would naturally have variations. And that brings us to the end of this episode. This is a look at 10 Bible contradictions that are not actually contradictions. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Let me know what you thought. Let me know down below in the comment section if you think that these are still contradictions, or do you think that the reasons that people give to explain away these contradictions are actually valid? Whatever you think, join in on the conversation. Look forward to reading your comments. If you did enjoy this one, don't forget to leave a big thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode.